All right, hello. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We are so glad you could join us today. My name is Katie Astroff. I'm a wetland scientist with civil and environmental consultants, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. We're excited to share an SWS e-learning experience during a time when many of us are looking for virtual opportunities to stay engaged, gain continuing education credits. This webinar is one way for us to stay connected to the wetland community during the global pandemic, and we hope everyone is well. Today's lecture and topic will be Too Much Salt and Not Enough Water, How Drought is Pushing Great Salt Lake to the Brink. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Andrea Stumpf and Rebekah Downard. Andrea is a laboratory technician in Gary Bolovisky's lab at the University of Notre Dame. Most of her research is based on the ecology of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. This research focuses on the phytoplankton, brine shrimp, and brine flies that form the basis of the lake's ecology. She also assists in research on the grasslands of Montana. She received her Master's of Science in Environmental Science from Villanova University. Her thesis looked at the effect of seasonal storms on salt marshes in New England. And then prior to her career in science, she received a Master of Fine Arts in Theater and worked in that industry. Rebekah is a wetland ecologist at the Utah Geological Survey. Her work there focuses primarily on Great Salt Lake wetland monitoring and assessment. Prior to that, she was the wetland coordinator for the Utah Division of Water Quality, where she worked to develop water quality standards for wetlands in Utah. She received a PhD in ecology from Utah State University, where she spent 5 years studying the impacts of impounded wetland management on wetland health around Great Salt Lake. She also received her master's degree in human dimensions of ecosystem science and management from Utah State University, researching strategies for acquiring water for wetlands. She received a bachelor's degree from Weber State University in zoology. So Andrea and Rebekah, over to you.
Becca, do you need me to share the slides?
Yeah, Brenna, why don't you do that? Hello, so I'm Andrea and I'm going to talk first. I will give a little bit of an introduction to the Great Salt Lake, and then I will talk a little bit about the research going on in the Bolosky lab that I have been involved with. So for the intro, I just want to talk a little bit about the Great Salt Lake. It is the fourth largest hypersaline lake in the world and the largest in the Western Hemisphere. It is, as I said, it's a hypersaline lake, and so it has some reduced biodiversity. However, it has extremely high productivity. It is a terminal saline lake, so that means that there is no outflow. The minerals come in with the rivers, and then they get stuck in the lake. It is a shallow lake, so it is about at mean lake elevation, which of course is now less than that, but at mean lake elevation, the mean depth is only 5.5 meters. So if you look at this picture here, on the left, we have the lake in 1986. Sorry, hold on, back one slide. There we go. So in 1986, it was at a record high elevation. So the lake elevation has been declining since then. And in 2021, which is the picture on the right, it hit a record low. It hit a new record low this year in 2022. In 1986, it covered approximately 2,300 square miles, and it is now down to less than 1,000 square miles. The other thing I want to bring your attention to in this picture is the railroad causeway that was constructed in 1959. And you can see a slight change in color between the north arm and the south arm. So the north arm has no rivers flowing in, and so it has become even higher in salinity and less productive. There is a breach that was open at some point and is currently being managed. So there is now some flow between the two arms, and there's discussion on how best to manage that breach. The last thing I want to mention on this map is just that there are two bays, the Bear River Bay in the northeast and the Jordan River Bay in the southeast. You'll see in 2021 and now in 2022, there's very little water in them, but normally they are lower salinities because of the rivers that flow into them. So there are 3 rivers that flow into them, flow into the Great Salt Lake. We have the Bear River that flows in the north into that Bear River Bay, and the Jordan River that flows in from the south into Farmington Bay. The third river is the Weber River. And those 3 rivers combined make up 88% of the water that flows into the lake. All of the rest of the water budget is from groundwater and precipitation. One second while we sort out a quick technical thing. So here we are with the next slide, showing that 88% from those 3 rivers and groundwater and precipitation. So the other thing on this map to point out is the dark purple areas, and those are the wetlands around the lake. And in fact, Utah is a desert, so 80% of all wetlands in Utah are found around the Great Salt Lake. And a bunch of these are right around the rivers and when they flow into the lake. The rivers are primarily driven by snowpack. So snowpack accumulates in the mountains in the winter, gets put through the river, and then there are some reservoirs and other diversions, but those river snowpack hopefully reach the lake. So as I mentioned, there is a reservoirs, and those are for the urban population that live near the Great Salt Lake. So we have the Wasatch Mountains and the Wasatch Front, which is an urban corridor, and it runs between the mountains and the lake on the east side of the lake. And here you're looking sort of over that urban corridor and then out into the mostly dry lake bed of one of the bays. So there's the reservoirs that are a source of diversion for the lake, and then there are also agriculture, and that a lot of the agriculture is in the northern part of the lake. And that 65 to 85% of all this water in those rivers is diverted for agricultural use. So all of these diversions have been going on for a really long time. About 150 years ago, European settlers arrived. It's a desert. They started diverting water back then. So there is a history of managing the water in this area. So now I'm going to get a little bit more into the current situation. So if you look at the graph on the right, this is the lake elevation starting in about 1970 until today. And you can see in that mid 80s time period, that high water level, and that's the picture you saw at the beginning. And then since then, it has been declining with some peaks and valleys, but essentially declining. You can also see in this graph the seasonal fluctuation. So every spring, when all that snow melts and goes into the river, the lake elevation rises a little bit. And then in the heat of the summer, evaporation, dry season, it goes down again. So what does that mean? One of the things it means is that as the lake elevation goes down, the salinity goes up. So if you look at this next graph, I have highlighted in the box the last couple of years. And you can see those seasonal fluctuations with the green being that lake elevation. And again, you see every spring it goes up. But the last couple of years, it hasn't gone up very much. So it's caused quite, but then it goes down a lot as we have had these dry summers. So that's partly the cause of this overall decline over the years. If you look at the triangle, purple and orange triangles, that is showing a couple measures of salinity, and it mirrors the lake elevation and has gone up and up, and we have reached a record high salinity this year at 196 parts per thousand, or 19.6%. The circles, just so you know, are from a deep brine layer that lies at the bottom of the lake, and if the lake isn't turned over, that sort of just sits there and so it has even higher salinity. So here we have the record low water level and the record high salinity. And as I've been mentioning, this has been happening over many years at this point, and one of the reasons for that is a drought. The Western Utah in particular is in a mega drought, and it's been essentially dry for over 20 years. And so less and less water is making it to the Great Salt Lake. We've had increased temperatures, which increases the evaporation in the summer. We've had decreased precipitation, which causes also decreased snowpack, so we aren't getting that runoff. So these dropping levels are causing exposed mudflats, as you see on the left here. And they're losing their water and then drying out in the summer. And one of just a note that is causing some air quality issues in the area. The other thing that's being exposed are microbialites, and these are on the right picture you can see, and they're similar structures to coral. They are carbonate structures, and they have microorganisms attached to them, and when they are exposed to water, they dry out. So similar to sort of coral bleaching, they dry out, their microorganisms die. So why should we care about all of this? Just in case you were unsure, there is both economic and ecological importance to this lake. So economically, there is $1.32 billion annually for Utah that comes from the lake, and that's from a variety of industries. We have mineral extraction. So if you've ever used Morton's water softener salt, you've used salt from the Great Salt Lake. About 2 million tons of minerals are harvested each year. The picture on your right is brine shrimp cyst harvesting. So brine shrimp lay cysts to overwinter to hatch in the spring, and they are hatched. They are harvested, and then they can be hatched as food for aquaculture. They're a high protein, good food, and they're used all over the world for aquaculture. And there's recreation, hunting, bird watching, boating, and there are also state parks around the area. Ecologically, one of the big things about the Great Salt Lake is I mentioned the bird watching. It's the number of migratory birds that pass through the lake. About 10 million birds use the lake as a stop on their migration every year, and that includes about 338 different species. And 90% of eared grebes in North America use this. So that is a species that is quite dependent on this lake. So let's get a little bit more into the food web and ecology. So as I mentioned, it is a hypersaline lake, so it is relatively simple food web, and there are two branches. One branch goes through benthic algae and organic particles, which are ingested by brine flies, and the other one is based on the phytoplankton, and which is then eaten by brine shrimp. So this is the basic structure. Both branches, unfortunately, are in trouble. So with the brine flies, I mentioned the organisms on the microbialites, and that is one of the food sources for young flies, their larvae. And so without those microorganisms, they're not getting as much food. They also use it as a juvenile flies sort of live on it. They habitate, and with even shallow microbialites, there's more wave action, and so they're getting knocked loose. As far as I know, there aren't really good numbers on brine flies, but observationally, there were significantly fewer brine flies this year. And hopefully we'll get some more information on that as we go. However, I'm going to talk more about the brine shrimp, because that is what my current research that I'm going to talk about is on. So the brine shrimp are Artemia franciscana, and they are the dominant pelagic herbivore in the lake. For reference, the adults run to about 12 millimeters long. Another thing to note about them is that they have two types of reproduction. I mentioned the cysts, and they can overwinter, but they also produce eggs in their egg sac, as you see in this picture, and live young, also in that little picture of the shrimp. So the Bolosky lab, Gary Bolosky, who's my PI, has been working on the Great Salt Lake for about 25 years. In the past, a study was done with Chad, Heidi, and Chad, who are previous members of his lab, where they looked at the survivability and reproduction of shrimp under a variety of factors. And that was temperatures, so 10 degrees, 20 degrees, and 30 degrees C. And that's sort of winter, summer, and fall, and then summer temperatures. They looked at salinities from 25 ppt to 120 ppt. They looked at the effects on all three life stages, the nuclei, the babies, hatched babies, juveniles, and the adults. They also looked at food source and food abundance. Some of their results were that survival was generally better at lower temperatures. There was a change in reproduction based on food, but what they found was salinity was seldom the major factor affecting these shrimp. However, they only went up to 120 ppt, and as I said earlier, the lake is now at 196. So we decided we really needed to look at higher salinities, because at some point salinity might become more of a major factor. And we are playing catch up a little, but we have managed to look at the 150 ppt and 180 ppt at 30 degrees so far. And so those are results I'm going to show you now. The way this is done is the shrimp are, a set of shrimp are put in bottles. They are fed twice a day to keep food consistent. We used a sort of medium amount of food, one of their favorite food types, phytoplankton. And then we counted how many had survived and if they'd grown, and 3 times a week. And this was a month-long experiment each time. So we're going to first look at just basic survival. So here we are, we have survival proportion on the left and the salinity on the right. So the lower salinities up through 120 are from this previous experiment. And then the 2 highest salinities on the right were done this year. And we have the nuclei, the juveniles, and the adults. And again, this was done at 30 degrees only. So basically, as we sort of saw in the other things in the previous study, survival was better at lower temperatures. So this is 30 degrees, this is the high temperature, and it does decline after a certain salinity that may be slightly different depending on the life stage, but essentially it does decline. Looks like the adults may have a peak and level off a little bit more, but certainly the juveniles and nuclei, they get up to higher salinities and they just don't survive as well. So we also looked at growth. So not only do we want to know if the nuclei survive, but are they actually turning into juveniles? And then are the juveniles able to turn into adults? And here we have a very similar pattern from the survival where after a certain salinity, it just goes down, especially with the nuclei. After 90 ppt, it looks like they just start to not be able to grow up. And the juveniles as well. As the salinity goes up, they are less able to become adults. So the other thing we looked at was the reproduction. And so we looked at both the oviparous reproduction with the cysts and the ovoviparous reproduction with the eggs that turn into nuclei. And this is the sort of most stark results that we found initially in this experiment, where in both cases, somewhere between 120 and 150, the reproduction just slows way down. And the results we got were very close to 0. And I want to just remind you once again that this was only at 30 degrees Celsius. So this is only in the summer temperatures. Our next steps for this are to look at the other temperatures, and hopefully we will see more reproduction in the lower temperatures. So those were all experiments done in the lab, in my lab. However, we do have a wonderful relationship with the Utah government. So we share data. They send us samples, the Utah Department of Wildlife Resources. So I wanted to just share some of the observations from the lake this year. And the first thing I want to bring your attention to on the left are the cysts and the nuclei, so the 2 types of reproduction. And this data goes on the top row, goes from January of 2022 until the end of October. And on the bottom row shows the last 5 years, the 5 years before that. So you'll see in the cysts and nuclei data that it does look like there are fewer nuclei than previously. And that's interesting partly because the food didn't seem to be very low, which is one reason why the shrimps might produce more cysts. So it is possible there is a shift in reproduction based on salinity. And you also can see with the nuclei, there was really only one pulse. They really produced them once in the spring. Right after that, lovely runoff when the salinity would have been the lowest. And then moving right, if we look at the juveniles, then the juveniles, were definitely fewer and slightly later. And that seems to be a direct result of the single pulse of nuclei, and the nuclei not all growing into juveniles. So then with the adults, this sort of growth continues where you got this sort of one peak, and yes, it was a pretty high peak, but then there it sort of leveled off quite quickly over the summer. And I know that the months are a little small, but if you can sort of look at the last 4 months, so starting, we're looking at sort of September, October, in all the graphs, all the shrimp numbers have declined, and the nuclei juveniles are extremely low at that point. So, and that would be because about that time is when the lake was reaching its lowest level and the salinity has gone even higher. So we have this graph which is showing sort of September, October, November. And it has the record low, which was November 3rd, of 4,188.5 feet. But you can see already by the end of September, it's quite low, and so the salinity is quite high at that point, and that is probably why we're seeing the lower shrimp numbers. So I did want to mention that we did have fewer samplings this year than in past years, and that's because of lack of access to the lake. The picture that you see here is a marina, and so suddenly the marinas that are used most often were unavailable. They were totally dried up, so it became harder to get access to the lake this year. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-host, Rebekah.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. And if I could have my screen share reactivated, that would be super. Let's see. All right. Let me just get to where we are. Great. So I was really excited when Andrea suggested that we do a presentation that covered both the Great Salt Lake and the wetlands, because that doesn't happen very often, but it's really all one ecosystem. The water that goes to Great Salt Lake almost all goes through the wetlands first. And the boundary between the two parts of this ecosystem is really dynamic and really hard to find. As the lake shrinks, the wetlands are going to expand into that. And as the lake rises, which it hopefully will do, it inundates those wetlands. And the birds that utilize these wetlands, with a few exceptions, are not picky. They will eat where the food is. So when we think about the support that this ecosystem provides, we really need to think about both halves of this. So about 400,000 acres of wetlands are found around Great Salt Lake. They're divided into 3 major classes based on differences in hydroperiod and dominant vegetation. The first type is called impounded wetlands, and like the name suggests, these are large impoundments. There's a dike or berm that is built along the downstream side of these wetlands that holds spring runoff in like a shallow reservoir. And then as water levels decline, as the irrigation season starts and the summer hits, the drought in that wetlands that would lead to a severe drawdown is attenuated because they have that water stored in there. And this is an adaptation to drought. Originally, these were built in the early 1900s because as the rivers were diverted for agriculture, there wasn't enough water making it to these river deltas, and that led to massive bird die-offs. So the first federal wildlife refuge established in the state was established because the people of Brigham City petitioned the Congress to actually establish a wildlife refuge at Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. And the first thing they did was build these impoundments so that they could keep enough water to support birds there. These impounded wetlands also have a really interesting adaptation for water policy, because having this discrete place of use along with water control structures to divert water into them has allowed water rights to be associated with these wildlife management areas. So they both have the ability to control water and legal access to a water right. And as such, drought has been not as dire here as it is in Great Salt Lake proper. These wetlands tend to be flooded for almost all of the year, and they're flooded deeply enough to support submerged aquatic vegetation. And this in turn supports large-bodied birds, our waterfowl like swans, geese, and ducks, as well as piscivorous birds like herons and pelicans. These form the core of a lot of our wildlife areas as seen in the green on that map. Adjacent to these wetlands, or fringing them, we have our fringe wetlands. We find these vast expanses of primarily emergent vegetation branching out from sources of water. So the outlets of impounded wetlands, as well as the deltas of streams and seeps. These wetlands tend to be really, really critical nesting habitat for the migratory birds that visit. There's good places to hide and eat and build a nest in there. And then they also perform some really important non-wildlife functions like sequestering nutrients and metals. The final class of wetlands are Playa mudflat wetlands, and we find these close to uplands. They also form where ephemeral bodies of water might be drying up, and they also occupy the bed of Great Salt Lake. These are very flat ecosystems with pretty sparse vegetation, and the plants that can grow are halophytic or salt-loving. They don't always look like much, but when they're flooded with a little bit of surface water, whether from a rainstorm or high spring runoff, there's huge hatches of macroinvertebrates that live in the soil that are just a smorgasbord for visiting shorebirds. This is also important nesting habitat for shorebirds because it's isolated from a lot of sources of disturbance and predators. If you look at that map again on the left, all of the orange is Playa mudflats, and you can see that it's getting farther and farther away from the people. So having these three types of wetlands, as well as a little bit of upland and the Great Salt Lake itself, provides a diverse suite of habitat that supports up to 10 million migratory birds every single year. And these represent 338 species of birds. Recognizing the importance of these wetlands, the Utah Division of Water Quality, where I used to work, set out on a Great Salt Lake wetland condition assessment. The goals were to first find a way to measure the health or condition of these wetlands, and then actually be able to estimate how many of the wetlands are in good condition, how many are in poor condition, and what is driving poor condition in these wetlands. So hopefully we can fix it. These wetland surveys were conducted between 2012 and 2020, and they focused on impounded wetlands and fringe wetlands. So we're not going to discuss the Playa mudflats. I gathered data at 50 Playa mudflat wetlands this summer, but it's not quite ready to present. So in the impounded and fringe wetlands, along 100-meter transects, we gathered data on the vegetation community, samples of macroinvertebrates, soil chemistry, water quality samples, as well as data on the physical disturbances around them. We went to 90 impounded wetlands and 45 fringe wetlands. And then there was also about 20 wetlands from Utah's West Desert that we used as a baseline for setting reference standards. So the first thing to come out of it was a multimetric index, or MMI, of wetland condition. And this is composed of three metrics that decline as stressors start to have an impact on wetland health. The first is the importance of highly tolerant species. So in high quality undisturbed wetlands, we see more cover and more representation from sensitive and intermediate species like Crescitruxalensis that's pictured in the upper left. Sites that are more stressed and starting to express that in the plant community are going to have more highly tolerant species like Juncus arcticus. Similarly, native species are the dominant species in really high quality wetlands. We see a lot of bulrushes like Chenoplectus americanus pictured there. But as disturbance has an impact on our wetlands, we're going to see more representation from introduced species like Phragmites australis. And then the final metric was the richness of wetland species. So this is based on their wetland indicator status. And in wetlands that aren't very disturbed, wetlands that are in good condition, you're going to see more obligate wetland species like Stuckinia pectinata and facultative wetland species. In disturbed wetlands, you see more facultative upland species like Carduus nutans and straight up upland species. They're becoming less wetlandy, more invaded. Overall, around Great Salt Lake, impounded wetlands were in pretty good health. More than 50% of the wetlands were measured in good, the remaining 50% in fair and poor condition. Fringe wetlands, however, because they can't be buffered from drought, there's less control of them, they tended to be in the majority of poor and fair condition. So the final part of this was looking at what is driving condition. So we picked out 12 different stressors listed in those rows and conducted a risk analysis following methodology from the EPA's National Wetland Condition Assessment. And this comes up with three estimates. The first is extent. That's just the proportion of wetlands that were experiencing high levels of stress from each of these stressor categories. The next is relative risk. This is the likelihood that that particular stressor is high at a site that's also in poor condition. So it's kind of getting at what is driving poor condition around there. And then the last metric is attributable risk. This is the likelihood that if we were able to remove that stressor, we would be able to improve wetland condition around Great Salt Lake. And two major stressors came out as having significant risk: alien species and hydrologic stress. And these, we will learn in the next few slides, are really pretty tightly linked. Sites with high cover of alien species, this is usually Phragmites australis, are 5 times likelier to be in poor condition. If we look at attributable risk, though, we have reason to be optimistic because it appears from this analysis that if we were able to remove high alien species threat, we would see an improvement in overall wetland condition. The two hydrologic stressors we have there are the presence of physical hydrologic stressors on site. This is going to be roads, impervious surface, water diversions, and then water quality discharges. Sites that have those really close to the wetland or in the wetland are about 3 times likelier to be in poor condition. Optimistically, there is significant attributable risk. So if we can remove those stressors, we can improve wetland condition. Unfortunately, some of the roads and water control structures are actually associated with wetland management in our impounded wetlands. So there's trade-offs for sure. And then drought stress also had a significant relative risk. Sites were 2.5 times likelier to be in poor condition if they were also experiencing high drought stress. This was a really simplistic measure based on the data that I had available to me. So if a site was experiencing drought stress, if there was no standing water or saturation. This might be why there is no significant attributable risk for that. So based on the data that we have, removing drought stress does not appear that it will improve condition. And there's two explanations for this. The first is that we have pushed these systems over the tipping point. The second is methodological. Not enough samples. You can see there's really large error bars on this, or too simplistic of a measure. So in our upcoming, or this last summer's Playa mudflat study, we did a better job of tracking where the water table was. So now we know what happens in highly stressed wetlands. I want to focus in on what we're actually seeing on the ground as we are 20 years into a mega drought. And in the wetlands, there's three major impacts. And the first is the expansion of Phragmites. Phragmites australis, if you are lucky enough to be unfamiliar with it, is a grass that's native to Western Europe. However, beginning in the 1990s, it started exploding around Great Salt Lake. And now we have tens of thousands of acres of it occupying our wetlands. It is an ecosystem engineer. So it pushes out native plants, raises the elevation of the wetlands, and it's really not good habitat. Very few species can actually utilize it because it grows so dense. Phragmites is what we call a disturbance specialist. This means it can take advantage of small opportunities like a little bit of exposed soil, get a foothold, and then grow prolifically. So the exposed lake bed that we're seeing as Great Salt Lake has retreated has been a really good opportunity for Phragmites to expand into that. The second way that drought impacts wetlands is that it stops us from being able to remove it. A lot of research has gone into how we can treat Phragmites around Great Salt Lake. And it's a 3-year process that involves first spraying with herbicide, then removing biomass by grazing, mowing, or trampling, and then spraying again in the 3rd year to capture anything that hasn't died. And when Phragmites is drought stressed, it won't take up the herbicide. So it disrupts that 3-year cycle of treatment. You could go out and spray it with herbicide, but that would be a wild waste of effort and money because it's just not going to be translocated into the roots and actually kill the plant. The next way we are seeing pretty severe impacts of drought is in the ability of our wetlands to support wildlife. The perennial vegetation that grows in these wetlands has a similar reaction to drought as the brine shrimp due to increases in salinity. It shuts off reproduction. So the plants aren't going to produce the seeds and the nutritious tubers that a lot of the waterfowl like to eat. In the more deeply flooded wetlands, the submerged aquatic vegetation will either not grow because there's not water, or it will senesce early, and then we lose both that food source and the macroinvertebrates that grow within that structure. One source of optimism for the birds, but not necessarily for Utahns, is that most of these migratory species, if they aren't finding food around Great Salt Lake, will migrate to farther east on the Central Flyway or farther west on the Pacific Flyway. However, we do have some species like the eared grebes that Andrea mentioned, as well as phalaropes, where Great Salt Lake is supporting huge proportions of their entire population. And they don't have anywhere else to go. We do still support wildlife, even in drought conditions, but we support them in concentrated areas. So where they can find food and water, we see more birds congregating there, and this really exacerbates outbreaks of avian diseases. So during poor water years, we tend to see outbreaks of avian botulism, which paralyzes birds and causes them to die. And then this year, we've also seen avian influenza around Great Salt Lake, and wildlife managers are really, really concerned about that. Drought also impacts the next generation of birds, not just the ones that are migrating through. The really, really bone dry mudflats act like super highways for nest predators, skunks, raccoons, foxes, and coyotes. Places that would be isolated and safe for birds to nest are no longer safe for them. And then the final way we're seeing impacts of drought in our wetlands is impaired air and water quality. When we have less flooding and less water inputs, we're going to see a concentration of the pollutants in that water. This is especially true for nutrients. We have a naturally eutrophic system, and then we let it settle and become concentrated and warm, and we see big blooms of filamentous algae. These have a really rapid life cycle, so then they begin to decay, and all of the dissolved oxygen in the water becomes eliminated through decomposition, and then that has a spiraling impact into the macroinvertebrates that live in there. We haven't seen harmful algae blooms that are a product of cyanobacteria in our wetlands yet, but it is a possibility, and they do thrive on these warm, still, nutrient-rich waters, so it's a concern that we have. And then we have air quality concerns, and this is really what's brought in a lot of public interest. The playas and mudflats, if they remain saturated or draw down, slowly will form a salt crust that protects the soils from wind events. But in really, really dry parts of that lake bed in the Playa mudflats, we're seeing the absence of that crust. And in wind events, the wind can pick up that clay, that fine particulate matter that can bury itself deep into our lungs. And then it also can potentially pick up metals that have been laying in this terminal basin since we started discharging to it. We really wanted to end on a positive note, and we've got big reasons to be hopeful. The first is near term, and that's looking at our water year, which began in October. If you take a look at the map on the left, you can see that snowpack in the watersheds that feed into Great Salt Lake is currently at 160% of normal. That's compared to the median snowpack value for this time of year. We've had a lot of snow. Things are looking really good. There's two caveats with that. First is that it's early in the season, so we will continue doing our snow dances and hope this continues. The second caveat is that we have had 3 back-to-back really bad summers. So our reservoir capacity, which is there on the right, is generally below 50%. So when this snowmelt runs off in the spring, whether it's a big year or a small year, the reservoirs are going to be filled before that water makes it down to Great Salt Lake. So what we really need is back-to-back years of really good runoff. But we also have some reasons to be hopeful for the long-term future of Great Salt Lake. This last year was the year of water for the Utah State Legislature, and they passed a number of bills that directly benefit Great Salt Lake, though they will take quite some time to start working. The first is the establishment of a $40 million water trust specifically to buy water for Great Salt Lake and figure out how to shepherd that from high in the watershed all the way down to the bottom of the watershed at Great Salt Lake. We also saw changes to beneficial use. This is a key part of prior appropriation water law. Every water right has to have a beneficial use associated with it. And even though it's clear that the water that makes it to Great Salt Lake has a huge economic benefit, legally, that was viewed as wasted water and up for appropriation. However, there was a bill passed that allowed Utah's Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to acquire water rights for their sovereign lands. This is the bed of Great Salt Lake and other water bodies. So now we have an agency that can hold water rights specifically for Great Salt Lake. This is a really big change. There is also a bill to conduct a Great Salt Lake integrated water assessment, and this is being complemented at the federal level, where the USGS is doing a saline lakes integrated water availability assessment for the entire Great Basin. We've got other lakes like Great Salt Lake, and these water assessments are looking at how much water is available, where it's going, where it's coming from, how much we need, both for human uses and for the ecosystem. I attended the USGS's meetings in October, and it really pointed out what a good place Great Salt Lake is in. We have not yet tipped over into ecosystem collapse, and especially compared to other lakes in the region, we have so much data available and so much interest in protecting it. The Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project that gathers the brine shrimp data that Andrea analyzes has been out on the lake since the 90s. We have a number of agency and researcher groups like the Great Salt Lake Technical Team that administers grants for studying really pertinent issues around the lake, a Great Salt Lake Technical Advisory Group that manages the brine shrimp harvest, a Salinity Advisory Council. There's really too many GSL things for me to list there, but it's really good. We have a lot of smart minds on this. And then outside of that, this year we saw the establishment of the Great Salt Lake Collaborative. This is a reporting effort on the part of all the newspapers in the state, as well as radio, looking to communicate through the news what's going on around Great Salt Lake and why we as Utahns should care, and doing some really great science communication, taking what's happening in these very technical groups and communicating it to Utahns at large. So with that, I think we have time for questions. And if you have any follow-up questions, Andrea and I are both happy to answer your emails.
All right, thank you both for that very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We can go to the Q&A. Again, I'll be posing your questions and maybe a few of my own that I've received through the Q&A button to the presenter. You still have time to submit some questions if you do have some. If you forget to ask a question or have to leave before the Q&A is over, you can email the presenters at the email addresses listed on this slide. So we'll get started here. So one question that I had is that you mentioned some of these areas are starting to convert to upland areas. What's the species composition that you're seeing in that? Is that mostly invasives there, or are you seeing a lot of native stuff come in too?
It's primarily invasive, and then some facultative grasses that aren't invasive, but aren't the wildlife species that we would hope. Invasive species like our thistles and our cheatgrass are often the first to get in there, but we do have some places that with like greasewood and other native halophytes that are also mixed in there as well. So it's both.
Okay. What has been some of the more beneficial management changes that have happened in the last several years as a lot more kind of bang for your buck kind of thing? I know there's a lot of the invasive species management. Is there any other kind of management changes that have been going on that you're seeing that this is really working or helping in the drought situation?
The invasive species management is kind of the highlight because it's science-based. It was a collaboration between university researchers and all the land managers around there. One of the things of note, I think, around Great Salt Lake is how well the managers work together. We have a lot of different wetland managers, and within the watersheds, they are active participants in their watershed councils. So Bear River Refuge is part of the Lower Bear River Council that sets out how much water they can expect, and these kind of collaborative things help maybe not make more water available, but improve the opportunity for wetland managers to take advantage of it if there's bonus water due to a rainstorm or any type of like infrastructure thing that somebody might have to forego their water. So that's not new, but it is an advantage that these wetland managers have because they've been on the ground for so long and have such good relationships.
Here's another question. How toxic are the sediments that might be blown into the air with the Great Salt Lake drying? There was a concerning New York Times article many months ago about this. Do you guys have any comments on this?
So the biggest health concern is actually the particulate matter, so the PM 2.5, because that can get into the lungs. I have not analyzed my soil samples yet, but the big concerns are arsenic, because the soils of Utah are naturally high in arsenic, and so they sink down on the lake bed. And then I think mercury is the other one we're really concerned about. Andrea, was metals analysis part of any of your experiments?
No, we haven't done any metals. I agree. I think the 2.5 PM is the major concern with lung, especially people in the area with pre-existing, asthma or something like that. I think it's already starting to be a problem. Yeah.
All right, and then I had one other question. I'm not seeing any more in the Q&A box. I think at the beginning you said, what was the percentage of water you said that was being diverted?
So for agriculture, it's, I believe, 65 to 85% for agriculture. So yeah, it's a lot. It's a majority is definitely diverted for agriculture. Obviously, there are also the urban diversions, but agriculture is the big one. I know there was talk about how to work with farmers to try and figure out ways to decrease that, but
Yeah, it's a big number.
They're really big watersheds, so yeah, lots to think on.
See, we have one more question came in. As the lake bed dries, do you see emergent vegetation expanding into the lake bed?
We do where there is a perennial supply of water. One of the fun things you can do on Google Earth is watch where we have wastewater treatment plant discharges. That's a constant flow of fresh water, and you can see the emergent vegetation expanding out from those constant sources of water. Where that water is not as constant, we're gonna see maybe initial expansion of fringe wetlands and then contraction.
Right. I think that's all for our questions. Again, if you guys have any more questions for our presenters, you can send them emails to their email addresses here on the slide. All right, we do want to recognize our SWS webinar series sponsors for 2022, the Witten Group, WildNote, Delta Land Services, and In Situ. You can find their information at the websites listed above. Please visit, like, and follow our SWS webinar sponsors. Our next webinars will be on January 19th for a presentation on unexpected results in adaptive management, and on February 16th, where we'll discuss the Higman Barge Removal Wetland Restoration. Check out our website and social media channels to learn more and register for upcoming events. And don't forget to complete the survey that'll be sent to you after this webinar to receive a certificate of participation and provide feedback on the webinar series. Thanks again to our presenters today and to our audience for participating, and have a wonderful day and stay well.